I've never been particularly good at hiring professionals. Some people seem to have this knack for scrolling through endless reviews, comparing prices and calling references. Me? I usually go with the first cheap ad I stumble across, cross my fingers, and hope the job doesn't turn into a disaster. Over the years, I've ended up with lopsided bookshelves, a plumber who left a leak worse than he found it, and one handyman who disappeared halfway through building a fence. So, when I decided to repaint the living room, I didn't even bother pretending I'd do it myself. I knew better. I hated painting, too much prep, too many rollers, too much patience required. I wanted it done, and I wanted it done fast. That's when I found the ad. It was buried near the bottom of the online classifieds. Nothing flashy, just a few words. Painting. Fast. Cheap. I work however I feel like. First I laughed. Who even puts that in an ad? I figured it was just a typo or maybe someone with a strange sense of humor. But the price listed was far lower than the other offers I'd seen. It almost felt suspicious, like the kind of bargain that came with a hidden cost. Still, something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was because I'd been spending too many nights alone, scrolling through ads just for the sake of reading about people's services and lives. Living alone has a way of amplifying even the smallest quirks you notice in others. The phrase kept rolling around in my head. I work however I feel like. I told myself it probably just meant flexible hours, or maybe he took long cigarette breaks. Either way, I clicked on the number and pressed call. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Deep, steady, with a rough edge like someone who didn't bother softening their tone for strangers. Oliver, he said. Just his name. Oh, hi. I saw your ad about painting. My voice cracked slightly, and I cursed myself for sounding unprepared. Yeah. What's the job? He asked. Straight to the point. I described the living room, the walls, the size, the color I wanted. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to sell himself, didn't even sound particularly eager. Just listened, humming once or twice like he was making notes in his head. When I finished, he said, All right, I'll come by tomorrow. That's it. I asked, surprised at how little back and forth there was. That's it. The line clicked off. No pleasantries, no confirmation texts. Nothing. Just a simple agreement that left me staring at my phone, wondering if I just made the worst or the most interesting hire of my life. That night, I barely focused on the TV. My mind kept wandering back to what kind of man left an ad like that. Who just said, I'll come by tomorrow, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I imagined he might be older, gruff, maybe with paint stains on his jeans and a truck that rattled down the street. Or maybe he was younger, careless, the kind of guy who showed up whenever he felt like it and worked in fits and starts. But beneath the curiosity, there was something else. Something I didn't want to admit to myself. Loneliness. I'd been single for a while, not really by choice, and it had a way of making you notice people more than you should. A simple ad felt like more than an ad. A stranger's voice on the phone lingered in my head longer than it should have. It wasn't that I was desperate. It was just that when your world is quiet, even small noises echo. As I stepped back to let him in, a wave of something hit me. Anticipation, curiosity, maybe even a spark of something I didn't want to name yet. The faint scent of his cologne drifted past me, warm and masculine, mixing with the sharper smell of paint from the cans he carried. And just like that, the job began. But I already knew, standing there watching him move through my hallway with such ease, that this wasn't going to be an ordinary project. Oliver didn't move like a stranger. That was the first thing I noticed. Most contractors I'd hired in the past shuffled in awkwardly, made a polite comment about the weather, and stood stiff until I directed them to the job. But Oliver, he walked through my hallway like he owned it, his tool bag swinging casually from one hand, his shoulders relaxed, his stride confident. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was more like ease, the kind of comfort you only see in people who don't feel the need to prove themselves. And yet, something about it pulled at me like gravity. I led him into the living room, my nerves prickling under the surface. I tried to focus on the walls, the trim, the job that needed doing, but my attention kept drifting sideways. His t-shirt clung to his frame, stretched across broad shoulders that tapered into arms dusted with muscle and ink. A black and gray tattoo coiled just under his sleeve, sharp lines disappearing along his bicep. His jeans were spattered with faint paint marks, faded and worn, but they fit him well, as though they'd been molded to his body over years of work. He caught me looking once, and his mouth tugged upward, just enough to register amusement before he turned back to the wall. "So, this is the room," I said quickly, pointing to the blank expanse of off-white. I was thinking a warmer tone, something less sterile. He tilted his head, running his gaze across the surface as though he were imagining the end result. Then he leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, arms folding across his chest, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "I'll tell you now, Matt," he said. "I've got rules." "Rules?" I echoed, my brow furrowing. For a moment I thought he meant payment schedules or hours of operation. He held up one hand, ticking them off with his fingers. "I work however I feel like. That means if I want music blasting, I'll play it. If I want to take a break, I take it. If I need space, I expect it." He dropped his hand, eyes meeting mine with a look that was equal parts serious and playful. I chuckled, not sure if he was joking. "That's fair enough, I guess." Oliver didn't laugh with me. Instead, his lips curved into the faintest smirk. "And if it gets too hot in here," he paused, straightening from the doorframe. His gaze locked onto mine, holding it a fraction too long. "Then I work in less clothing. Sometimes just underwear. Helps me focus." I blinked, caught off guard. My laugh came out too quickly, too reflexive. "You're joking." His smirk didn't fade. "Am I?" For a second, the silence stretched. I felt the air between us shift, charged, like the hum of a power line overhead. I wanted to believe he was just teasing, trying to test how easily he could rattle me. But his expression, calm, confident, eyes holding mine, told me there was more truth in his words than humor. I forced a shrug, trying to mask the heat climbing my neck. "Well, it's your job. Do whatever makes you comfortable." "Good," he said simply, and the matter was settled. He dropped his bag onto the floor with a dull thud, crouched down, and began pulling out paint cans and rollers like he'd lived in this house his whole life. I leaned against the opposite wall, trying to act casual, but inside my thoughts spun like a wheel that wouldn't slow down. I wasn't used to people who laid out their rules so bluntly, who didn't dress their words up in politeness or apology. It was disarming and strangely refreshing. More than that, though, I wasn't used to feeling this spark, the restless energy that had settled in my chest since the moment he stepped inside. I hadn't felt drawn to anyone in a long time, not in a way that mattered. My last relationship had ended almost 2 years earlier, dissolving quietly into nothing after months of polite silence and unspoken resentment. Since then, I'd gone through the motions. Work, sleep, weekends spent half-heartedly trying to convince myself I enjoyed being single. But the truth was I'd grown numb. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months, until I stopped expecting to feel that rush of connection with anyone. And yet, here I was, watching this stranger unpack brushes with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgeons, and I couldn't shake the heat curling in my chest. Oliver glanced up once, catching my eye. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, half a second, maybe more. But it was enough. Enough to send a flicker of something running through me, something I tried to disguise by shifting my weight and clearing my throat. "You've done a lot of painting jobs, I assume?" I asked, my voice too careful. He didn't look away from the roller he was assembling. "Plenty. Ever get bored of it?" He shrugged. "Work is work. You make it your own. That's why I've got my rules." There it was again, that confidence, that ease of saying exactly what he wanted without worrying how it landed. I envied it. I admired it. And, though I wouldn't admit it aloud, I found it incredibly attractive. Oliver stood, rolling his shoulders as he sized up the wall once more. "This'll take a few days. Should look brand new when I'm done." His words were ordinary, but the way he said them, with that low, gravel-edged voice, made them feel heavier, final, as if the job wasn't just about the walls, but about something else entirely. I nodded, forcing a smile. "That's great. I'll stay out of your way." "You don't have to," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. Again that gaze. Firm, steady, holding mine a beat too long. Then, as casually as he'd said it, he turned back to the paint cans. I exhaled slowly, my pulse skipping. He hadn't touched me, hadn't said anything overt, and yet the room already felt charged. For the first time in years, I realized something unsettling. I wanted to know what it meant to stand in his orbit. Oliver worked like someone who didn't need instructions. He unpacked brushes and rollers with a quiet rhythm, spreading a drop cloth across the hardwood as though he had done it in 100 different rooms before mine. I stood near the doorway, telling myself I was there to make sure he had what he needed, but in truth, I was caught between fascination and nerves. The thing about Oliver wasn't just his appearance, though that was hard to ignore. It was the way he carried himself. Every step seemed deliberate yet unhurried, like he was moving to music only he could hear. His body seemed to fit into every motion perfectly, whether he was bending to open a paint can or stretching up to tape along the ceiling. I tried to focus on the walls, to picture how the color would change the room, but my eyes had other plans. They kept following him, tracing the way his jeans tightened around his thighs when he crouched, or how the muscles in his forearms flexed when he twisted the cap off a paint tin. The smell of fresh paint filled the air, sharp and chemical, but somehow it blended with something else, the faint, warm scent of his cologne. It clung to the air around him, subtle but noticeable, the kind of fragrance that stayed with you even after someone left the room. At one point, he looked over his shoulder and caught me watching. A grin pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You don't have to stand guard, you know? I won't run off with your paintbrushes." Heat rushed to my face. I'm just making sure you don't need anything." Oliver chuckled low in his throat, shaking his head as he dipped the roller into the tray. "Sure, whatever you say." I turned my attention to my phone, pretending to scroll through messages, but every time he stretched the roller high above his head, my gaze wandered back. His t-shirt rode up slightly with each motion, revealing the sharp lines of his torso, the faint trail of ink from the tattoo creeping along his ribs. Then, with no warning, he tugged the shirt off entirely. No hesitation, no apology, just a simple, matter-of-fact motion, as if removing a shirt in the middle of someone's living room was the most natural thing in the world. "It's too hot in here," he said casually, tossing the shirt onto a chair. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to respond. He hadn't said it in a flirtatious way, hadn't even looked at me as he did it. He was already focused back on the wall, dragging the roller in smooth, even strokes. Still, my thoughts stumbled. "It's just paint," I reminded myself. "He's working. This doesn't mean anything." But the voice in my head didn't sound convincing, especially as my eyes traced the curve of his shoulders, the way the muscles in his back shifted with every stroke. I told myself to look away, to give him privacy, but the truth was, Oliver wasn't shy about it. If anything, he seemed perfectly aware of his presence, and the more natural he was, the more unnatural it felt for me to ignore it. Cleared my throat. "You weren't kidding about your rules, huh?" "Nope," he said simply, not pausing in his work. "I told you how I do things. And you always paint shirtless? When it's hot, yeah." He glanced over his shoulder, his grin tugging upward again. "You're not complaining, are you?" The question caught me off guard. My laugh came out shaky. "No. No complaints." "Good." He turned back to the wall, humming faintly under his breath as though the matter was settled. But the spark lingered. For the next hour, I tried to busy myself, fetching water, checking emails, even rearranging books on the shelf just to avoid standing still. Yet no matter what I did, my attention snapped back to him. It wasn't only the way he looked, it was his energy. Confident, grounded, steady. Every movement radiated ease, and it made me realize just how tense I always was in my own space. When he stretched to reach the upper corner of the wall, I caught myself staring again. His torso lengthened, each muscle outlined in quiet detail. A bead of sweat traced down his spine, catching the light before disappearing into the waistband of his jeans. "Careful," Oliver said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You keep staring like that, I'll start to think you're inspecting me instead of the walls. My stomach dropped. He'd said it casually, almost playfully, but the tease landed squarely. I wasn't, I stammered, fumbling for an excuse. I was just checking your technique. His laugh echoed through the room, low and amused. Sure, my technique. He dipped the roller back into the tray and shook his head, still smiling. Whatever helps you sleep at night. I wanted to protest, to deny it again, but instead I felt a reluctant smile tug at my lips. There was no point in pretending. He saw right through me, and somehow, instead of embarrassment, what I felt was a strange lightness. The banter grew easier after that. I asked him about his favorite jobs, and he told me about painting an entire house a bright, shocking blue because the client insisted on standing out. He asked me about my work, and though I didn't usually talk much about it, with him it came naturally. Each exchange carried a thread of humor, a flicker of something more beneath the surface. And every so often Oliver's gaze would linger, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that I noticed. Long enough that it felt intentional. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the first wall was already transformed. The color glowed warmly in the fading light, richer than I had imagined. Oliver leaned back to inspect his work, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm, his chest rising and falling steadily. You'll like it better tomorrow, he said, once it dries. I nodded, though my focus wasn't entirely on the wall. Looks good so far. His eyes flicked toward me again, lingering just that second too long. Then he smirked, rolling the tray aside. I'll be back tomorrow to finish. Same rules apply. And with that, he gathered his things, still shirtless, still unbothered, leaving me standing in the quiet room with my thoughts tangled between fresh paint and something far more complicated. The next day, Oliver showed up right on time, carrying the same bag of supplies and that same unbothered air that seemed stitched into him. He didn't bother with greetings beyond a simple nod, and before I could even ask if he wanted coffee, he'd already spread the drop cloth and was prying open a can of paint. The room smelled faintly of fresh color from the day before, but what struck me more was the comfort I felt watching him move. It didn't take long for his shirt to come off again. No announcement this time, just a casual tug over his head when the air got warm. By then, it almost felt routine, though the sight of him still made my stomach knot in ways I wasn't willing to examine too closely. I pulled a chair from the dining table and sat nearby, pretending to check emails but really just watching him in that quiet rhythm. He didn't seem to mind. In fact, he broke the silence himself. So, what do you do? He asked, stretching the roller high above his head. I blinked, caught off guard. Work, you mean? He glanced at me over his shoulder, smirk faint on his lips. Yeah, unless sitting around watching painters is your career. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I'm in design. Architecture, mostly. Residential. Nothing too exciting. Sounds exciting enough, he said, turning back to the wall. At least you make things that last. I just cover them up with color. There was something in his tone, an acceptance, maybe even a kind of pride, like he didn't feel the need to compare. And you? I asked, curious now. How long have you been painting? Oliver chuckled. Long enough to know it's not just about paint. I frowned. What do you mean? He lowered the roller, resting it against the tray. His eyes swept the room slowly, as though he were taking it all in again. People think they hire me for walls, but half the time I'm just there. They talk. I listen. Sometimes I say a few things back. A coat of paint is easy. What people really want is change. They want to feel like something new is possible. I stared at him, surprised by the weight of the answer. That's deeper than I expected from a classified ad. His grin widened, but there was no mockery in it. Told you. I work however I feel like. The conversation didn't stop there. As he painted, we slipped into a rhythm of words that surprised me with their ease. He asked about my family, my last relationship, what drew me to architecture. At first, I stumbled, not used to sharing personal details with a stranger. But his silence in between questions was patient, steady. It invited honesty. Before long, I was talking about things I hadn't said aloud in years. How my last boyfriend had left quietly one winter morning, a note on the counter and nothing else. How I hadn't dated since, telling myself I was busy, but really just afraid of starting over. How silence in the evenings could feel heavier than I ever admitted. Oliver listened, never interrupting, rolling paint in long, even strokes. When I trailed off, he finally said, "Sounds like he didn't know what he had." The words landed with more weight than I expected. I opened my mouth to brush them off, but something about the way he said it, quiet, matter-of-fact, like he wasn't fishing for anything, made me stop. "What about you?" I asked, needing to shift the focus. "Any long-term relationships?" He hesitated for the first time since I'd met him, his roller pausing just shy of the corner. Then he said, "A couple. With women. None worth writing home about." I tried to hide my disappointment, nodding like it was just small talk. "So, straight then?" Oliver smirked, not looking at me. "Labels are tricky. I don't spend much time worrying about them." The answer wasn't a door closing, but it wasn't wide open either. My chest tightened at the ambiguity, but I found myself strangely drawn to it. He set the roller down and grabbed a brush to work near the trim, crouching low. "Besides," he added, his voice lighter now, "why does everyone care so much who's kissing who? Feels like a waste of energy." Couldn't argue. True. For a while we painted in silence. The sound of the roller was steady, soothing, almost meditative. And yet, beneath it I could feel the undercurrent building, the kind of tension that wasn't loud but undeniable. At one point, Oliver glanced up from the trim, eyes catching mine. "Are you always this nervous around shirtless men?" My breath caught. His tone was teasing, but his gaze lingered. "I'm not nervous," I said quickly, too quickly. He raised a brow, smirking. "Could have fooled me." I laughed awkwardly, but the sound softened into something genuine. There was no malice in his words, just playfulness, the kind that made my chest feel lighter even as it stirred something deeper. After that, the teasing became part of the rhythm. When I offered him water, he smirked and said, "Thanks, but I'm fine. You look thirstier than I am." When I asked if he wanted to take a break, he said, "Why? You getting tired of watching me?" Each line was a joke, but each one carried a weight beneath it, like he knew exactly how far to push without crossing the line. And the more we talked, the less I felt like this was just about paint. He told me about his dream of one day running his own business, something small, something he could control. He admitted frustrations with past jobs, with people who treated him like he was invisible. I found myself telling him more, too, about how I sometimes felt like an outsider in my own life, building houses for others while not really knowing what home meant for me anymore. Somewhere between his stories and mine, I realized the walls weren't the only thing changing color. The air between us shifted, warmed, softened. When Oliver finally leaned back to inspect his work, he caught me looking again. This time, neither of us looked away immediately. The silence stretched, long enough that I felt it in my chest, long enough that laughter bubbled up just to cut the tension. He grinned. I laughed, but under it the spark burned steady. I hadn't expected to feel restless that morning. Normally, weekdays blurred together. Coffee, work, an evening that felt too quiet, then bed. But that day, every sound outside made me check the clock. Every minute that passed without the doorbell made my stomach tighten a little more. It wasn't just about the painting. I told myself that again and again. But when I caught myself straightening the couch cushions for the third time, I knew better. I wanted to see him. When the bell finally rang, I opened the door a little too quickly. Oliver stood there, the same paint-stained bag in hand, his smile easier this time, his shoulders looser. "Morning," he said, his voice low but warmer than before. "Morning," I echoed, stepping aside to let him in. He walked past me with the same confidence as before, but now there was something else in his stride. A familiarity, as though he wasn't just a worker arriving at a job, but someone returning to a space that already felt his. He set the bag down, surveyed the wall we'd finished, and gave a small approving nod. "Not bad. Not bad," I repeated, feigning offense. Looks great. He smirked, pulling off his shirt almost immediately, balling it up and tossing it onto the same chair as yesterday. It'll look even better when I'm done. Besides, it's too hot to wear this anyway. The sight should have been familiar by now, but it wasn't. His torso caught the morning light, every line of muscle sharpened, a sheen of sweat already forming at his collarbone. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze back to the paint cans. Oliver caught it anyway. He didn't call me out this time, just chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he set up the roller. We worked in companionable silence for a while. He painted, I hovered, occasionally offering water or a rag he didn't really need. The air between us carried the faint hum of yesterday's conversation, as though we'd skipped a few steps in knowing each other. "You're quieter today," Oliver remarked at one point, glancing at me from where he stood by the far wall. "I'm not," I said, but my voice betrayed me. He raised a brow, his grin playful. "Sure you're not." The room grew warmer as the hours passed, the sun pressing against the windows. Oliver's skin gleamed, sweat tracing a path down his chest as he moved. He didn't seem to mind. If anything, he leaned into it, rolling paint high above his head, muscles stretching taut, his breathing steady but heavier with the heat. I caught myself staring again, the way I always did, and looked away too late. "You're going to burn a hole in the back of my head if you keep staring that hard," he teased, laughter tugging at his voice. "I wasn't." He cut me off, walking closer with the brush in hand. "Relax. I didn't say I minded." My heart skipped. The casualness in his tone didn't match the weight of his words. He stopped just a step away, tilting his head slightly. "Hold still." Before I could ask why, he reached forward, his thumb brushing the edge of my cheek. I froze, breath caught, as he wiped a small smear of paint from my skin. The touch was brief, but the warmth lingered long after his thumb moved away. Our faces were closer than they'd ever been, close enough that I noticed the flecks of color in his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the damp shine of sweat at his temple. For a second, the air between us shifted, heavy with possibility. My pulse raced, my lips parted without sound. If either of us leaned in, even slightly, but Oliver broke the moment with a grin, stepping back, twirling the brush between his fingers like nothing had happened. "Can't have you walking around with paint on your face, can we?" I laughed too quickly, the sound too loud, desperate to cover the silence. "Thanks. Anytime." He turned back to the wall, humming faintly as he painted again. But I couldn't move on as easily. My chest still burned with the nearness of him, the spark that had flared in that split second. I knew I shouldn't want this. I knew lines like these weren't supposed to blur. He was a painter I'd hired for a job, nothing more. But the thought rang hollow in my head. Every glance, every smirk, every lingering silence told me this wasn't ordinary. I sat back in the chair, pretending to scroll my phone again, but my focus was shot. My mind replayed the touch, the grin that followed, the way my body had leaned forward without permission. The room was full of the sound of the roller, steady and rhythmic, but beneath it my thoughts roared. When Oliver finally stepped back to admire his work, he glanced at me once more, eyes locking onto mine. There was a flicker there, something unreadable but undeniable. It lasted only a heartbeat before his easy smile returned. "Almost done for today," he said, setting the roller down. I nodded, forcing my voice steady. "Looks good." But my thoughts betrayed me, he looks better. And in that quiet admission, I felt the pull again. Dangerous, undeniable, and growing stronger every second he was near. By the third day, the walls were almost done. Each brushstroke and roller line brought the room closer to completion, but instead of feeling relief, I felt an odd heaviness settle in my chest. The project was nearly finished, which meant Oliver's visits would end too. The thought shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did. That evening, when he finally set his roller aside and stretched his arms above his head, I could see the strain in his muscles, the sweat darkening his skin, the quiet exhaustion in his face. On impulse, I slipped into the kitchen and came back with 2 cold drinks. "Here," I said, offering him one. He took it with a nod, twisting off the cap in one smooth motion. Thanks. He sank onto the couch without hesitation, sprawling out like it belonged to him. His presence filled the room in a way I couldn't ignore. I sat beside him, careful at first, leaving space between us. But space never stayed space around Oliver. He shifted, stretching his legs, until his knee brushed mine lightly. He didn't move away, didn't apologize. It was casual, almost accidental, but the warmth of the touch spread through me like a current. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping, the hum of the evening settling over us. Then Oliver tilted his head, looking at me with that steady gaze that always seemed to see more than I was ready to share. "You're quieter again," he said. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You always say that." "Because it's true," he replied, leaning back against the couch. "You get this look sometimes, like you're thinking too much." I hesitated, swirling the bottle in my hand. "Maybe I am." He raised an eyebrow. "About what?" The question hung between us, simple yet heavy. I should have brushed it off, changed the subject, but the warmth of his knee against mine and the ease of his presence wore down my defenses. I exhaled slowly. "About you." His eyes didn't flicker with surprise. If anything, the corners of his mouth curved upward slightly, as though he'd been waiting for me to say it. "Oh," he said, his voice low, teasing. "And what about me has you so distracted?" I swallowed, my pulse hammering in my throat. "Just the way you are. Confident. Unapologetic. It's distracting." The words felt heavy as they left me. Heavier still when the silence that followed stretched out. For a moment, I feared I'd said too much, that I'd stepped past a line we'd been dancing around. But Oliver didn't move away. He didn't frown or laugh it off. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his shoulder brushing mine now, his voice a quiet rumble. "I told you I had rules." My breath caught. The way he said it, playful but edged with something else, left no doubt that he understood exactly what I meant. "You're not exactly making it easy to ignore you," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "Good," he said simply, his smirk deepening. The air thickened between us, heavy with things unsaid. His knee pressed against mine, steady and warm. His shoulder stayed against mine, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. I turned my head slightly, and for a fraction of a second, our faces hovered closer than they should have, the space between us charged electric. If I leaned in, just a little, I could cross it. If he did, everything would change. But instead, Oliver chuckled softly, leaning back just enough to break the tension, though his eyes never left mine. "Relax, Matt. You look like you're about to jump out of your skin." I laughed, shaky and nervous, but it came out genuine. "Maybe I am." "Don't," he said, his tone softer now. "You're fine." The way he said it, calm, certain, settled something in me. My pulse still raced, but the fear in it eased, replaced by a slow warmth I couldn't deny. We sat like that for a long time, talking in low voices. He told me about his younger years, how he'd started painting because it was the only work he could get at the time, how it stuck because he found comfort in the rhythm of it. He admitted he hated following rules that weren't his own, which was why he worked the way he did. I found myself telling him things I rarely told anyone. How I'd always been better at designing spaces for others than for myself. How my own apartment never felt finished, never felt like home. He listened the same way he painted. Steady, focused, as if every word mattered. And every so often, our eyes would meet and linger just a beat too long. Not enough to push us over the edge, but enough to remind us both of the line we were towing. When Oliver finally stood to gather his things, the room felt different, warmer, heavier, alive in a way it hadn't before. He slung his bag over his shoulder, glancing back at me with that same smirk. "See you tomorrow," he said, his voice low, steady, certain. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As the door closed behind him, I sank back onto the couch, my chest tight with everything that hadn't been said, everything that had. We hadn't kissed. Not yet. But the way he looked at me, the way he leaned in and stayed there, it left no doubt. It was only a matter of time. By the time Oliver rolled the last coat of paint onto the wall, the room was transformed. The sterile white had given way to warmth. Color filling every corner like sunlight had been trapped in the brushstrokes. It looked alive in a way it never had before. "You're all set," Oliver said, rinsing the roller in the tray. His voice was steady, casual, but hearing those words sent a pang through my chest. "All set?" I repeated quietly, as though saying it aloud might make it true. But I didn't feel finished. Not with him here. He set the roller aside and stepped back, admiring the work. His bare torso gleamed faintly with sweat, shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that suddenly seemed too final. He'd done what he came to do. The job was over, and jobs ending meant people leaving. I stood at his side, staring at the same walls, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I realized how much I didn't want this to be the end. Oliver glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Maybe I should leave one wall unfinished," he said. "That way I'll have an excuse to come back." I laughed, but it caught in my throat. "I wouldn't complain. Didn't think you would." His grin softened, the tease wrapping itself in something gentler. We stood in silence, side by side, as the paint dried. Normally silence made me uncomfortable. I always felt the need to fill it with small talk or noise, but this silence was different. Heavy, charged, not empty at all. I thought back to the last few days. The teasing, the way he'd brushed paint from my cheek with his thumb, the casual press of his knee against mine on the couch. More than that, I thought about the conversations, the way he'd listened, really listened when I spoke. The way his presence filled the quiet without suffocating it. It wasn't just about how he looked. Yes, he was handsome, impossibly so, but what had struck me most was how easy he was in his own skin, how unapologetically he lived by his own rules. Being near him made me feel lighter, less guarded, like I could shed some of the careful armor I carried through life. He turned then, facing me fully, and for a moment his eyes held mine with an intensity that rooted me to the floor. "Not bad, huh?" he asked, nodding toward the walls. I nodded back, my voice low. "It's more than not bad. It's perfect." But I wasn't talking about the paint anymore, and judging by the flicker in his eyes, he knew it. The silence stretched again, longer this time. My pulse quickened. His hand hung at his side, so close to mine I could almost feel the warmth radiating from it. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, he brushed the back of his fingers against mine. It was the smallest touch, barely there, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with the force of it. He didn't pull away immediately. His hand lingered, just enough for me to know it wasn't an accident. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, unreadable, but softer than I'd ever seen them. Then, just as slowly, he let his hand fall back to his side. The corner of his mouth curved upward, that familiar smirk returning, though gentler now. "Guess that's it," he said. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod. "Guess so." But even as the words left my lips, I knew this wasn't an ending. Not really. The walls were finished, yes, but the space between us, the spark that had grown over days of teasing, silence, and stolen glances, wasn't finished at all. If anything, it was just beginning. Oliver gathered his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. He walked toward the door, then paused, turning back. "You'll be seeing me again," he said simply. No question, no doubt, just certainty. And then he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of paint and cologne, the echo of his smirk, the warmth of his touch still buzzing against my skin. I stood alone in the newly painted room, staring at the colors that seemed brighter, deeper, more alive than I'd imagined when this all began. My chest felt heavy and light at the same time. I realized then that this wasn't about a painter or a project. It wasn't even about attraction, though that was undeniable. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. And as I sank onto the couch, still looking at the walls, a thought settled over me like a truth I couldn't deny. I thought I was just hiring a painter. Instead, I found someone who painted color back into my life.